Section 15 of National Geographic Magazine Volume 2, Numbers 1 and 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A critical review of Bering's first expedition, 1725–30, together with a translation of his original report upon it. By William H. Dahl. Part 5. Resume of the results. Bering had brought a party, together with supplies and material, over the rough and difficult but long-travelled routes to Okhotsk. Wherever he went, he found settlements and roads such as they were. He transported his material to Bolsheretsk, and from there across the peninsula to Lower Kamchatka settlement. It would have been much easier and shorter to have doubled the peninsula and taken his stores by sea. One of his party had already explored the straits near Cape Lopatka, but there was the chance of disaster in this plan, and with his stores of terra firma, Bering cannot be blamed for taking the land route, especially as the difficulties would not inconvenience him personally. He succeeded in getting his stores and ship rights to the place designated, and there prepared himself for the voyage. In all this there was difficulty and trouble enough of a certain kind. That it all was surmounted with success is very creditable to Bering and his officers, but to call it exceptionally heroic or extraordinary is to forget the hundreds of others who preceded Bering without the strong arm of the government at their backs, who made the trails he followed, who founded the settlements at which he rested, who raised the dogs, the horses, and the cattle which were used or consumed by his party. Whatever praise we may feel due to Bering and his companions, and it is certainly no stinted allowance, the appreciation of their struggles cannot fail to include, with justice, the still more remarkable and nearly forgotten pioneer labours of the undaunted Siberiaks, who paved the way not only for Bering's weary journey, but for the slow yet never-ceasing march of civilization. After leaving port, Bering traced the shores of Kamchatka and eastern Siberia as far as East Cape. Thence he sailed in a northeasterly direction. At 3 p.m. August the 14th, land was seen astern. The vessel continued in the same direction until 3 p.m. the next afternoon, having at most sailed about 24 hours out of sight of land, but in shallow water. Bering then concluded he had gone far enough to show the separation of Asia from America, or any land to the eastward. No doubt he was influenced by the testimony of the residents of Kamchatka, who knew the work which had been performed in this region by Dezhnev and others, and also by the fact that the native testimony all pointed the same way. If he was convinced of the truth of this testimony, he would have been disposed to accept as conclusive evidence which would not be so regarded by critics. All the evidence shows Bering as faithful to the letter of his orders, honest, patient with the ill-doing or insubordination of others, but perfectly satisfied with the accomplishment of what he had been specifically directed to perform, and with a tendency to limit the specifications to the narrowest construction they would bear. He adventured nothing beyond. In the arbitrary government under which he served, with the violent competition between foreign officers in the Russian service for promotion in rank and pay, who can criticize him for the prudence and caution which kept him well within his instructions? I certainly do not. But to say that he was a cautious, prudent, and sagacious officer is a different thing from asserting he was a daring, adventurous, and heroic explorer. I have not been able to discover anything in his career justifying the latter estimate of his character. At all events, in the present case, it must in time have occurred to him, or have been suggested by his officers or by the Kamchatkans after his return, that the mere sailing off shore in admittedly shallow water for 24 hours was not an absolutely conclusive proof that the continents were separated. Here was a man with a new vessel, a full crew, a year's provisions for all hands, who has come half around the globe, taking 3½ years to do it, building ships, and at no end of labour of one sort and another. All this to get into the region where there is a question to be answered, and when he gets there he barely gives 24 hours to searching for that answer with the month of the season still available for work, and then starts for home without settling the question, with the right conclusion, it is true, but not of his own discovery, and without securing definite proof to defy critics. Leaving out of account the continent within half a day's sail, which he fairly ran away from, ignorantly, where is there anything adventurous, daring, or heroic in such conduct? It is evident that if Bering had sailed along the coast, which the Chukchis said extended to the westward, instead of going offshore, away from it, he would have confirmed that part of their testimony, and given high probability to the assumption of their correctness in the rest. As it was, he left the question in a state so unsettled as to be a subject of debate for nearly half a century. Even authorities so friendly as Dr. Campbell, assuming with great confidence that Bering's conclusions as to the separation of the two continents were erroneous. It was not until the voyages of Captain Cook and his associates were given to the world in 1784 that the matter was settled beyond controversy. Even in regard to the details of his voyage, it was only through Bergh's publication of Chaplin's logbook of the voyage in 1823 that the public were informed as to what Bering did, and it was only in 1847 that the unmutilated but still ambiguous report of 1730 was accessible even in Russian typography. We find that all the authorities who published in the last century copies of Bering's map and accounts of his expedition arrived at what Lauridsen calls an interesting misunderstanding. This misunderstanding was that he had sailed along the Chukchi coast as above suggested, and that his farthest point was in latitude 67 degrees 18 minutes on the coast of northeastern Siberia. How was it possible that men of such exceptional intelligence as Du Halde and D'Anville and Müller and Hasius and Euler and Campbell were all so deceived? The facts are as follows. 1. The verbatim report of the voyage, the logbook of the expedition, Bering's chart in its entirety, were inaccessible to the public for many years. The chart has never been fully engraved for publication. 2. The fragments of the report which were circulated in print were ambiguous in their language or erroneously modified, while the published reductions of the chart which got into print were misleading or even erroneous. 3. Two conflicting versions of the manuscript chart were circulated and appear to have been officially sent out. That which appears to be the later of the two is in some details quite erroneous, and at variance with Bering's report as printed, and with the facts derived from Chaplin's logbook, these two constituting the only authentic original information which has yet reached the public in printed form. But these two sources of correct data about the expedition were not printed until long after the charts had been widely circulated, while the extracts from the report which appeared in print, even under so friendly an editor as Dr. Campbell, were so modified as to support rather than expose the original error. How this arose there may be something in the Russian archives to explain, or if not, the case seems insoluble. Whatever conclusion one arrives at, it is difficult to acquit Bering of all responsibility for the misconception, if, as Lauridsen claims, he was responsible for the chart of Du Halde in the form it was engraved. In his report he states that their northernmost latitude was 67 degrees 18 minutes, that "all along the sea coast to this place wind elevated mountains." On turning to the Du Halde chart we find the range of mountains continued along the Chukchi coast until it reaches the latitude of 67 degrees 18 minutes, where it stops. If Bering drew the chart so, it would have been deception, but it is quite as probable that the editor modified the chart in engraving it to correspond to his understanding of Bering's ambiguity. As this would present nothing questionable to the reader, in the absence of the details omitted by Bering, it would have been nothing surprising if Campbell's interpolation of a false longitude for Lower Kamchatka in his list of positions might have been, not a typographical error, but an attempt to make the position agree with his erroneous assumption. If it was a pure accident, the coincidence is extraordinary. Of course Bering never was on this coast, but Du Halde's map is so engraved as to lead directly to the false inference that he had been. Again, Bering says in his report that at his turning point the land no longer extended to the north, and that no projecting points could be observed in any direction. Since he had deliberately sailed away from the shores without attempting to follow their trend, this observation would be absurd unless we suppose it addressed to a reader who took it for granted that the vessel was still skirting the coast. There is no mention in his report of the fact that he had sailed away from the coast, nor of the still more important fact that the soundings showed that the water was comparatively shallow and discolored. Of course, in the absence of direct proof of the separation of Asia and America, this last evidence would tend to indicate that Bering was only in a bay or shallow arm of the sea, and that he suppressed it shows, if not a want of candor, at least an injudicious reticence. The map for the day when it was made in the earlier version was a good one, and is appropriately praised by Cook, who had a copy of Campbell's Harris on his vessel when exploring in the same region 50 years later. In his report of the trip eastward from Kamchatka in 1729, Bering says nothing about the weather being foggy or stormy, but merely asserts that he sailed nearly 200 versts and saw no trace of land. He leaves it to be inferred that he could have seen land if it had been there to see, which, if the weather was foggy, was not true. The impression which these facts leave upon the mind is that Bering did certainly frame his language so as to convey the idea that his evidence of the separation of the two continents and of the absence of land eastward from Kamchatka was more conclusive than it was in reality. That this was done to avoid criticism seems a natural inference. That an examination of his list of positions would have shown the location of the point whence he turned back to be to the eastward of the easternmost of his reported land is true, but his list of positions was not published with his report, does not agree with his maps, and when published by Campbell was garbled, as I have shown. That the truth, however, did get out, and that criticism was not successfully avoided, is a matter of history. There can be little doubt that Bering's anxiety to undertake the second expedition which followed was stimulated by a desire to set these criticisms, which would naturally be magnified by his enemies, finally at rest. It may be suggested that Bering's report was modified by the authorities, though why they should make these particular modifications is not very evident. Bering was the only person who could profit by them, and the natural conclusion is that he should be held responsible. In pointing out that some of Bering's acts are vulnerable to criticism, I am far from desiring to sully his memory or give the idea that he was not entitled to great praise for what he accomplished, much of which was admirably done. I wish merely to apply a gentle corrective to the exaggerated and injurious flattery and undiscriminating praise which has been injudiciously indulged in by his latest biographers. If the interest in the subject be stimulated by discussion from these opposing points of view, so as to result in the publication of some of the material still hidden in the Russian archives, I shall be more than repaid for the time I have devoted to the question, even if the publication of the original data should show some of my conclusions to be ill-founded or erroneous. Note: the reception of the original work of Berg while reading the proofs of these pages has enabled me to correct several errors of previous writers, but it was too late to incorporate here the additional material which Berg's work affords. This will enable me to add in a future publication some historical data which have never appeared in English and which are necessary to complete the record. I desire in this place to express my gratitude for and appreciation of the liberality of the authorities of that ancient seat of learning, the University of Upsala, as exhibited in their willingness to send such a valuable document to a foreign student half around the world for purposes of historical research. End of section 15.
Section 16 of National Geographic Magazine Volume 2, Numbers 1 and 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Supplementary note by Marcus Baker. On the alleged observation of a lunar eclipse by Bering, 1728, 9. Bering was in eastern Siberia, Kamchatka, in the adjacent waters in 1728 and 1729. Could he have observed a lunar eclipse there at that time? According to the Ephemeris of Manfred, Manfredius Eustachius, Novissime Ephemerides motum coelestium e Castinianus tabulus ad meridianum Boninae subtutati octoribus Eustatio Manfredio, etc. Thomas 1 ex anno 1726 in annum 1737, etc. 4 Boninae MDCCXXV. Published at Bonn in 1725, there were 2 partial eclipses of the moon visible in Europe in 1728, and 2 total eclipses of the moon in 1729. In regard to these 4 eclipses, the Ephemeris furnishes the following data. 1728, February 24. Eclipse begins, 18h, 32min. Total immersion. No measurements recorded. Middle of eclipse, 20h, 0min. Immersion begins. No measurements recorded. Eclipse ends, 21h, 29min. Digits eclipsed, 9h, 51min, south. Sun rises, 18h, 36min. Sun sets. No measurements recorded. Eclipse, partial. Sun's declination, -9 degrees 38 minutes. Sun's hourly motion, plus 0 degrees 0.9 minutes. 1728, August 19. Eclipse begins, 4h, 7min. Total immersion. No measurement recorded. Middle of eclipse, 5h, 35min. Immersion begins. No measurement recorded. Eclipse ends, 7h, 3min. Digits eclipsed, 7h, 45min, north. Sun rises. No measurement recorded. Sun sets, 6h, 49min. Eclipse, partial. Sun's declination, plus 12 degrees 42 minutes. Sun's hourly motion, minus 0 degrees 0.8 minutes. 1729, February 13th. Eclipse begins, 7h, 45min. Total immersion, 8h, 46min. Middle of eclipse, 9h, 35min. Immersion begins, 10h, 24min. Eclipse ends, 11h, 25min. Digits eclipsed, 19h, 46min. Sun rises. No measurements recorded. Sun sets. No measurements recorded. Eclipse, total. Sun's declination, minus 13 degrees 16 minutes. Sun's hourly motion, plus 0 degrees 0.8 minutes. 1729, August 8th. Eclipse begins, 12h, 2min. Total immersion, 13h, 2min. Middle of eclipse, 13h, 52min. Immersion begins, 14h, 42min. Eclipse ends, 15h, 42min. Digits eclipsed, 19h, 44min, south. Sun rises. No measurements recorded. Sun sets. No measurements recorded. Eclipse, total. Sun's declination, plus 16 degrees 9 minutes. Sun's hourly motion, minus 0 degrees 0.7 minutes. In this table the calendar is Gregorian. The time is apparent or true sun time. The day is reckoned from noon and the hours are counted continuously through the entire 24. The present observatory in Bonn is in latitude 50 degrees 43 minutes 45 seconds north, longitude 0 hours 28 minutes 23 seconds east from Greenwich. At the date of the first eclipse, Bering was on his way across the southern end of Kamchatka, from Bolsheretsk to Lower Kamchatka. This would make his position somewhere near latitude 55 degrees north and longitude 160 degrees, or 10 hours 40 minutes east from Greenwich. He was therefore 10 hours 12 minutes east of Bonn, for which we have the elements of this eclipse, as computed by Manfred. With this data together, with the latitude and sun's declination, we have the following data for the eclipse in the region where Bering was. Beginning of eclipse, 4 hours 44 minutes. Middle of eclipse, 6 hour 12 minute. End of eclipse, 7 hour 41 minute. Sun sets, 5 hour 7 minutes. This means that the sun set bearing about west by south, 1/2 south, and the moon rose in partial eclipse, bearing about east by north, 1/2 north, at 5 hour 7 minutes, after apparent noon or 23 minutes after the eclipse had begun. The eclipse lasted for 2 hours 34 minutes after sunset, or until 7 hours 41 minutes in the evening, thus rendering observation of the last contact plainly visible. At the date of the second eclipse of 1728, August 19th, Bering was at sea somewhere in the vicinity of the strait which bears his name. Assuming his position to have been latitude 65 degrees north and longitude 188 degrees, or 12 hours 32 minutes east from Greenwich, equal to 12 hours 4 minutes east from Bonn. And as before taking the data from Manfred's ephemeris, we have as follows: beginning of eclipse, 16 hour 11 minute. Middle of eclipse, 17 hour 39 minute. End of eclipse, 19 hour 7 minute. Sun rises, 16 hour 4 minutes. It thus appears that the first contact of this partial eclipse of the northern limb of the moon may have been just barely visible to Bering. The moon bearing about southwest by west was entering the earth's shadow about 5 minutes before the sun's rising and its own setting. If much importance attaches to determining the possibility to Bering of observing this eclipse, then a more precise calculation is needful. At the date of the first lunar eclipse of 1729, February 13th, Bering was at Lower Kamchatka, in latitude 56 degrees 3 minutes north and longitude 162 degrees 15 minutes, or 10 hours 49 minutes east from Greenwich, equal to 10 hours 21 minutes east from Bonn. For this place we have from Manfred: eclipse begins 18 hour 6 minute. Total immersion 19 hour 7 minute. Middle of eclipse 19 hour 56 minute. Immersion begins 20 hour 45 minutes. Eclipse ends 21 hour 46 minute. Sun rises 19 hour 21 minute. Thus it appears that this total and almost central eclipse of the moon, lasting 3 hours 40 minutes, began at Bering Station 1 hour and 15 minutes before sunrise of February 14th, the total immersion occurring 14 minutes before sunrise. It is manifest, therefore, that Bering might have observed this eclipse. The second lunar eclipse of 1729 occurred August 8th, when Bering was in or near Oxstock and about returning to Europe. We may assume his position to have been latitude 59 degrees 20 minutes north and longitude 142 degrees 40 minutes, or 9 hours 31 minutes east from Greenwich, equal to 9 hours 3 minutes east from Bonn. This eclipse was also total and almost central, but at Bering Station was wholly invisible, beginning at 9 hours 5 minutes a.m. and ending at 12 hours 45 minutes p.m. End of section 16. End of National Geographic Magazine Volume 2, Numbers 1 and 2. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.